The day Marcus installed the Level 2 EV charger in his driveway, he'd felt like he'd finally arrived at something he'd earned. Not just the charger, a sleek Tesla home unit that cost $8,000, but the entire life it represented. The hybrid SUV, the solar panels on the roof, the mental image of himself as someone who cared about the future while also being practical about it. His wife Sarah had kissed him when the installation was complete, both of them watching the electrician do the final checks on the dedicated 240-volt line that now ran from their home to a weatherproof outlet at the edge of their driveway. It was late September, the kind of perfect California evening where the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and pink, and everything felt possible. "This was a good idea," Sarah had whispered, her hand finding his. "This was exactly what we needed." 3 months later, Marcus wasn't so sure. The charger had been the talk of Willowbrook Hills for exactly 2 weeks. Then it had become something else entirely, an assumed public utility by one particular neighbor who'd made an entire decision about her family's future based on its mere existence. Her name was Corinne Mitchell, and she lived 3 houses down on the same side of the street. Marcus had waved to her maybe 4 times in the 2 years they'd lived here. She had a son in high school and a teenage daughter, drove an older Range Rover that never quite looked clean, and had a habit of standing in her driveway drinking coffee while staring at her phone with the intensity of someone reading a ransom note. The first time she'd asked about the charger, Marcus had been pulling into the driveway after work on a Monday in early October. Corinne had jogged over before he'd even unbuckled his seatbelt, her face flushed, her expression caught between embarrassment and excitement. "Hey, hi, so I've been meaning to ask you about that," she'd said, pointing at the charger. "I've been thinking about getting an electric car for months now, and I saw you had that installed, and I wanted to know if it's complicated, if you like it, because I'm thinking about making the switch next month, and I want to know if it's worth it." Marcus had climbed out of his car, already feeling the internal calculation beginning, the weight of neighborly obligation against the simple desire to be helpful. Corinne had always seemed fine, a little scattered maybe, a little too loud sometimes at neighborhood gatherings, but fine. "It's incredible," he'd said, gesturing toward the charger. "Best decision I've made in a while, honestly. Saving a fortune on gas, and it's just convenient as hell. I charge it overnight usually, and by morning it's full." He'd watched her eyes light up in a way that made him immediately regret his enthusiasm. "That's amazing," she'd breathed. "So it just sits here, like, can I ask you a weird question? Can I use it?" The question had hung in the air between them, and Marcus had known in that moment that he was standing at a crossroads. One path led to, of course, no problem, and the other led to an awkward conversation about electricity costs and liability, and the general principle that just because something exists doesn't mean it belongs to anyone who wants it. He'd taken the first path. "Sure," he'd said, already aware of a small voice in his head screaming at him not to. "As long as you pay for the electricity. It's not cheap, but I can figure out what it costs per charge and we can settle up." Corinne had practically vibrated with gratitude. She'd touched his arm, just a brief, impulsive gesture, and thanked him 3 times before jogging back to her house, her face transformed by something that looked a lot like relief. Sarah had been skeptical when he told her. "You're going to track every single charge?" she'd asked, not unkindly. She was making dinner and the smell of garlic and tomato filled their kitchen. "That's going to be complicated, Marcus." "How complicated can it be?" he'd said, already regretting it. I don't know, check the app, see how much it costs, and ask her to Venmo me occasionally." Sarah had said, in the particular tone she used when she loved him but thought he was being naive. "And she'll remember to do that." But Corinne had remembered, for the first month anyway. She'd begun coming by every other evening with her tan Range Rover, plugging it in while Marcus pretended not to notice the small thrill of being helpful that came with watching her face light up. She'd charged her car, and then she'd chat with him for a few minutes. About the weather, about her kids, about how much money she was already saving by not buying gas. "It's incredible," she'd said one evening in early November, her breath misting slightly in the cooling air. "I can't believe I waited this long, and it's so convenient just being able to charge at home." At home, not at his house. At home, as if the charger had become an extension of her life rather than something she was borrowing. By mid-November, she'd stopped bringing her checkbook and Venmo requests had turned sporadic. Marcus would see her car plugged in when he came home from work and feel a small knot of dread form in his stomach. By December, he'd stopped mentioning it to Sarah, though he knew she'd noticed by the way she'd pointedly ask, "Did Karen charge again tonight?" in that same skeptical tone. The real problem started in January, 3 months after Karen first asked to use the charger. Marcus received his electricity bill for December, and he sat down on the edge of his bed in the darkness of early morning to read the charges. His hands had gone cold as he scrolled through the itemized usage breakdown. The numbers didn't make sense at first. They couldn't make sense. His December bill was nearly double what his November bill had been. He'd checked the charger logs on his Tesla app, hands shaking now, and the data was unambiguous. Karen had been charging her Range Rover nearly every single day, sometimes twice a day. The vehicle's massive battery, far larger than his car's, was drawing enormous amounts of power. A single full charge cost somewhere between $18 and $23, depending on electricity rates. Over 4 weeks of near-constant charging, she'd accumulated somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 in electricity costs. $350 that she hadn't paid him. He'd sat there in the dark, staring at the number, and felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, not yet, but a kind of dawning incredulity. A realization that what he'd meant as a kind gesture had been taken as a permanent gift, without ever being offered explicitly, without ever being accepted with the weight that such an acceptance should carry. Sarah had found him there when she'd woken up, still holding the tablet, still staring. "What's wrong?" she'd asked, immediately in that way wives can sometimes do, recognizing distress the moment they see it. He'd shown her the bill. She'd read it quietly, then set the tablet down and sighed. "You have to say something," she'd said, "like today." "I know." And she might get defensive. People do when they're embarrassed. "I know. So you need to decide right now if you're prepared for that." Marcus hadn't been prepared, but he'd also been out of options. He'd waited until Saturday morning when he was sure Karen would be home, and he'd walked down to her house with the cold calculation of a man about to have one of those conversations that changes the texture of everyday interactions. The morning was gray, January in Southern California, which was mostly just regular California, but with some wind thrown in and a melancholy sense of broken resolutions. Karen had answered the door still in her pajamas, her hair piled on top of her head, her face registering surprise first and then immediate guilt, as if she'd been caught. "Hey," she'd said too brightly, "what's up?" "Can we talk," Marcus had said, "about the charger?" He'd watched her face change, the brightness dimmed. Something else took its place, something harder, more guarded. "Yeah, of course," she'd said, but she hadn't opened the door wider, hadn't invited him in. Instead, she'd stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind her, as if she needed to prepare a barrier between her home and whatever he was about to say. Marcus had taken a breath and laid it out. He'd shown her the numbers. He'd explained the electricity cost per charge. He'd been calm and reasonable and very deliberately not accusatory, though every word had felt like it was carrying an accusation anyway. "I think we need to figure out a payment arrangement," he'd finished, "for the electricity." Karen had stood very still while he talked, her arms crossed, her face slowly flushing. When he finished, she'd stared at him for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. "I didn't think I had to pay," she'd said quietly. "I assumed. I thought it was like a neighborly thing, like lending someone a cup of sugar." "A cup of sugar costs like 50 cents, Marcus had said, and immediately regretted the tone in his voice. "This is $350 a month, Karen. That's not the same thing." "So you're keeping track," she'd said, not a question. "I'm not trying to be a jerk," Marcus had said, which was a lie. He was trying a little bit. He decided it was justified. "But I need you to understand that this is an actual cost." Karen had looked away toward the street, toward nothing in particular. "How much?" she'd asked quietly. "I was thinking maybe split it. I mean, the charger was an investment for me anyway, but the electricity, that's straight cost. Maybe we could do." But Karen had already moved her head, had already made a decision written across her face in the form of something that looked like hurt. "I can't afford this right now," she'd said. "I've been going through a lot of stuff. The car. I needed the car because I got a job that pays better, but it's further away, and I was spending so much money on gas that it wasn't worth it. And then you said I could use the charger, and I thought." She'd trailed off, and Marcus had stood there on her porch, holding the responsibility of this conversation like something too heavy to set down. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he'd said, "but I need to be realistic about my own situation, too." "So what, you want me to stop using it?" Corinne's voice had shifted. Something harder had entered it. "You're going to charge me." "I'm not charging you. You're paying for electricity you used. That's not the same thing." "It feels the same to me," Corinne had said, and something in the way she'd said it had made it clear that she'd already decided how to interpret this interaction. Not as a neighbor trying to establish a boundary, but as a neighbor who decided to suddenly become greedy. He could see her doing it in real time, watching the frame shift in her mind. "I'll stop using it," she'd said coldly. "I don't want to be a burden." And she had stopped using it for about a week. Then on a Thursday evening, Marcus had come home to find her car plugged in again. And the next day, and the day after that. He'd felt something turn in him, not anger, but something like resignation. The realization that he'd already chosen his path and she'd chosen hers, and they were on a collision course neither of them seemed willing or able to divert. He'd spent a week trying to decide what to do, and in that week, an idea had taken root. One that would seem reasonable and professional, and not at all like he was punishing his neighbor for daring to feel slighted by his request for payment. He would simply change the charger settings. The Tesla charger had built-in access controls. He could restrict the charging session to certain times, certain durations. He could make it inconvenient without making it impossible. He could make sure that Corinne understood without saying a word that she was no longer welcome to use it whenever she pleased. It was the kind of solution that felt clever when he was alone in his home office, and petty when he was actually standing on his driveway implementing it, adjusting settings on his phone, essentially locking Corinne out of the one thing that had solved a significant problem for her. Sarah had watched him do it and said nothing, which was somehow worse than if she'd argued. "Just so you know," she'd said eventually from the doorway of his office, "this is how feuds start." Marcus had closed his laptop. "She should have talked to me. She should have asked about costs instead of just assuming it was free." "Sure," Sarah had said, "and you should have put a price on it right away instead of playing Mr. Helpful for 3 months. You both made choices." "So what do you want me to do?" "I don't know," Sarah had said. "I just know that restricting it without talking to her isn't going to fix anything." But he'd already restricted it. The damage, such as it was done. And then, 3 weeks later, Marcus had received an email that would make everything exponentially worse. The email had arrived on a Wednesday morning, and Marcus had almost deleted it without opening it. The subject line read, "Regarding the charging station at 447 Sycamore Drive." His stomach had dropped the moment he'd seen Corinne's name in the sender field. Not the tone of the subject line, formal, businesslike, but the fact of it at all. Corinne didn't email about anything. Corinne showed up at his door or called or left notes in his mailbox in her sprawling, slightly chaotic handwriting. An email meant she'd consulted someone, probably called someone, maybe a lawyer. He'd opened it carefully, as if the words themselves might explode. "Dear Mr. Chen, I am writing on behalf of my client, Corinne Mitchell, regarding the unauthorized modification of the charging station located at 447 Sycamore Drive. Over the past 4 months, my client has relied on access to this charging station as part of her home and commute arrangements. While there have been recent discussions regarding electricity costs, the unilateral restriction of access without prior notice or discussion constitutes an effective breach of the neighborly arrangement that was originally established. Further, my client has made significant transportation decisions based on the availability of this charging station, including the purchase of a vehicle and acceptance of a position that requires longer commuting distances. The sudden and arbitrary restriction of access has now placed my client in financial hardship. Before we proceed with formal action, I would like to suggest a brief settlement discussion. I believe this matter can be resolved without litigation if both parties are willing to discuss reasonable terms. Please contact my office within 5 business days. Sincerely, James R. Westbrook, attorney at law. Marcus had read it 3 times, each time hoping that the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less threatening, something more reasonable, something that made more sense. A lawyer. Corinne had hired a lawyer. He'd immediately called Sarah, who'd been in a client meeting but had called him back within 15 minutes with the kind of priority she usually reserved for actual emergencies. "Slow down," she'd said. "She hired a lawyer because you changed the password on the charger." "Not the password, the access settings. I set it so it only charges during specific hours." "And that made her hire a lawyer." "Apparently," Marcus had said, already feeling defensive. "Or maybe she called one and they decided to send a scare email. I don't know how this works." Sarah had been quiet for a moment. "Did you respond to anything she said? Deny her access completely?" "No, I just made it inconvenient." "Then this is probably just a negotiation tactic," Sarah had said, but she'd said it in the way she said a lot of things, like she was trying to convince herself. "You should call a lawyer, just to get your bearings." The lawyer Sarah had found, a pleasant man named David Torres who specialized in property and neighbor disputes, had read the email with an expression that suggested he'd seen this movie before. "It's bluster," he'd said, setting the email down on his desk. "Mostly, the argument about your neighborly arrangement is weak legally. You own the charger, you're not running a public utility. You can set conditions on its use. But, Marcus had felt his stomach drop again. "But she's not entirely wrong about the fact that you made an offer and she accepted it. The offer wasn't exactly detailed about terms and conditions, so that could be a problem depending on how a court looked at it. And the fact that she made a major purchase decision, the car, based on your offer creates some liability on your end." "What kind of liability?" "Reliance liability, probably. If she can prove that she specifically chose her transportation situation because you offered the charging station, and then you suddenly took it away in a way that created financial hardship, she could potentially argue that you're responsible for that harm." Marcus had felt the conversation slipping away from him, moving into a landscape of legal concepts and financial liability that had seemed impossible 24 hours ago. "But I didn't take it away completely. I just made the hours limited." "Right, and that's good for you legally. That shows you're trying to preserve some access. But the restriction might not be enough to satisfy whatever she's asking for, which is probably why her lawyer is reaching out now." "What do I do?" David had leaned back in his chair. "You could respond to the letter yourself with a measured response. You could hire me to respond. Or you could try talking to her directly first, see if this is real or if she's being advised to do something that doesn't actually reflect what she wants." Marcus had gone with the direct approach, which in retrospect had been a mistake. He'd walked down to Corinne's house that evening without calling first, expecting to catch her before dinner. Her daughter had answered the door, a tall girl with dark hair and her mother's defensive eyes, and had gone to get her mother. Corinne had appeared in the doorway looking tired in a way that hadn't been there when they'd last spoken. She was wearing scrubs, Marcus had noticed, hospital scrubs, which meant she was working hard probably if the shadows under her eyes meant anything. "We need to talk," Marcus had said. "I think my lawyer should handle this," Corinne had replied immediately, her voice smaller than he expected it to be. "Why," Marcus had said, "why did you hire a lawyer instead of just talking to me?" "Because the last time we talked, you decided to cut me off without even having a real conversation about it," Corinne had said, and now her voice was stronger, edged with anger. "You changed the settings on the charger. I don't know if you know this or not, but I paid for an appointment to test drive cars yesterday, and I was planning to go. I was going to talk to you. I was going to ask if we could figure out a payment plan or something. And then I went to charge my car last night, and it wouldn't let me. It just wouldn't. And you didn't have the decency to even tell me you were going to do that." Marcus had stood on her porch, and something about the hurt in her voice had made him realize that he'd made this worse than it needed to be. Not the restriction, the sneakiness of it. The fact that he'd chosen a technical solution over a human conversation. "I'm sorry," he'd said, and he meant it. "I should have talked to you first. But Corinne, I also can't just give away $800 a month in electricity." "800?" Her voice had shot up. "I'm not charging $800 worth of electricity per month. That's not even possible. I charge my car maybe once every other day. The Range Rover battery is huge." "I know how big the battery is. I paid for the car. And I drive a lot, so yes, I'm charging it, but not every single day, and definitely not $800 worth. My bill went up by almost $400 in December alone," Marcus had said, and the anger had come back, had filled in the space where his apology had been. "So we split it," Karen had said flatly. "Or I stop coming, but this thing of sneaking around and restricting my access in the middle of the night without even telling me, that's not neighborly, Marcus. That's not even honest." "I'm being honest now," he'd said. "No, you're not. You're here because you got a lawyer letter and you're freaking out. You're not here because you actually care about talking to me. You're here because you're worried about your legal liability." The accuracy of that observation had stung. "So what do you want?" Marcus had asked, already knowing the answer probably wouldn't be reasonable, wouldn't be simple. "I want you to unrestrict the charger," Karen had said. "And I want us to work out a real payment plan, or I want to pay you a flat monthly fee for access. I don't care. But I'm not going to just stop using it because you decided I was being unreasonable. I made a real decision based on what you offered me, and now I need it to work. And if you won't make it work, then yes, I'm going to let my lawyer handle it." She'd closed the door before he could respond. Marcus had stood there on her porch in the gathering darkness, and he'd understood with absolute clarity that he'd crossed some kind of invisible line. That there was no going back from this now, no friendly resolution, no chance to laugh about this misunderstanding over drinks next summer. He'd called David Torres that night and told him to respond to the lawyer's letter. The response had been carefully worded, legally non-committal, and thoroughly unhelpful in solving the actual problem. It had basically said that Marcus was open to discussing a resolution, but that the charger's usage was at his discretion, and that Karen had no legal claim to it. It had also said that Marcus would be unable to discuss this further, except through his attorney. He'd felt like a coward pushing that door between him and Karen, this barrier of lawyers and formal language. But he'd also felt like he didn't have a choice anymore. The situation had grown teeth. It had become a thing unto itself, separate from the two people who'd created it. Sarah had read the lawyer's response and said very little, which was worse than if she'd said a lot. "I'm protecting myself," he'd told her, which was only partially true. "I know," she'd said, "but you're also losing something. You're losing the chance to be the bigger person, and once you lose that, it's hard to get it back." 2 weeks later, Karen's lawyer had sent a formal demand letter. He was requesting reimbursement for $1,500, the estimated cost of electricity Karen had used. He was also requesting continued access to the charger at no charge, claiming that Marcus had entered into an implied contract by offering the charger and allowing Karen to rely on it for 3 months. And he was requesting $5,000 in damages for tortious interference with business relations. Because Karen's new job, which she'd only been able to take because of the cheaper transportation costs provided by the charger, was now in jeopardy because she couldn't afford to get back and forth to work. The letter had concluded with a threat to file a lawsuit if the matter wasn't resolved within 30 days. David Torres had reviewed the demand and called Marcus immediately. "She's overreaching," David had said. "The damages claim is weak, but the contract claim has some merit and the electricity reimbursement is reasonable. Here's what I'd recommend. We offer to settle for the electricity cost, let's say $1,200 to be conservative. We give her continued access to the charger with a specific payment plan going forward. We require her to sign a written agreement outlining the terms, and we move on." "How much is this going to cost me?" Marcus had asked. "Legal fees, probably another $2,000 or $3,000 depending on how far we go, plus the settlement. So we're looking at $4,000 to $5,000 total to make this go away." Marcus had felt something like despair settle over him. The charger had cost $8,000. The solar panels had cost $15,000. The hybrid car had cost $35,000. All of these things were supposed to be investments in a better future. And instead, they'd become the foundation of a financial and legal nightmare because a neighbor had asked for help and he'd decided to help her without setting a boundary. "What if I just tell her no?" he'd asked. "What if I just refuse? Then she files a lawsuit, and we spend the next year in court fighting about this. And we probably lose the electricity cost anyway, plus we're out 30 or 40 grand in legal fees. Plus your reputation in the neighborhood gets destroyed, because this will be public, and nobody's going to want to believe that the neighbor with the fancy EV charger didn't screw the single mom who just wanted help making car payments." "She's not struggling that much," Marcus had said, already hearing how it sounded. "Doesn't matter what she's actually struggling with," David had said. Matters what the narrative is, and right now her lawyer is very good at controlling the narrative. Marcus had authorized the settlement offer. Corinne's counteroffer had arrived in a new email 3 days later, and it had made it clear that whatever negotiation Marcus had been attempting was no longer possible. Her lawyer was now asking for the full $1,500 in electricity costs, plus a written guarantee of continued access to the charger at no charge for at least 1 year, plus another $2,000 in inconvenience damages for the times she'd been unable to charge her car due to the access restrictions. "She's playing hardball," David Torres had said when Marcus called him in a panic. "I think what's happened is that she's gotten some other advice. Maybe a friend told her that she should ask for more, or maybe she's talked to someone else online. There are groups for this stuff now, neighborhoods where people share stuff about screwing over the system, and she's decided that she can get more money. So what do I do? You could pay it, you could fight it, or you could try one more direct conversation." Marcus had chosen the direct conversation, though by this point he was no longer sure that he and Corinne were even speaking the same language anymore. She'd become a plaintiff in his mind, a name on legal documents. He'd become a defendant in hers, a symbol of something larger, entitlement, probably, or the casual cruelty of people with money toward people without. He'd sent her a text message asking to meet for coffee somewhere neutral. He'd been surprised when she'd agreed. The coffee shop had been halfway between their houses, a small place called The Grind where they served locally sourced whatever and charged $7 for a latte. Marcus had arrived early and gotten a table in the back, away from the windows. Corinne had shown up exactly on time, still in her hospital scrubs, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger but also more exhausted. They'd ordered coffee. She'd gotten regular black coffee, which seemed like a statement of some kind, and sat across from each other with the careful distance of people who'd become adversaries. "I don't want to do this," Corinne had said without preamble. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't want any of this." "I know," Marcus had said, and he did know. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the fact that her eyes couldn't quite meet his. "But I also can't just roll over," she'd continued. "I've got 2 kids. One of them is heading to college next year. I got that job because the pay is better and I need it to be better. And I made a decision about the car based on something you offered, and now I can't just go back to what I had before." "I'm not trying to hurt you," Marcus had said, which was what he'd said before, which hadn't worked then either. "But you are," Corinne had said quietly. "Even if you don't mean to, you are. And I don't know how to make you understand that without lawyers and formal letters, because we haven't been able to understand each other any other way." Marcus had stirred his coffee, which he'd barely touched. "What do you want from me?" Corinne had looked away, toward the other customers, none of whom were paying any attention to them. "I want the charger to be available whenever I need it. I want to stop worrying about whether it's going to be there tomorrow. And I want you to not feel like I'm stealing from you because I'm not trying to steal from you. I'm trying to survive." "I could set up a payment plan," Marcus had said. "Like a real one. You pay me $150 a month for the next 6 months. That covers the electricity you used, plus some of my costs for installing it and maintaining it. And then after that, we reassess." Corinne had shaken her head. "Your lawyers already said you don't owe me anything. That offer doesn't exist from a legal perspective. So if I accept it, I'm accepting something you're not obligated to give, which means I'm coming from a position of weakness. And I can't do that anymore." "So you want the full demand? You want the $2,000 in damages plus the electricity costs plus the guaranteed access?" "I want what's fair," Corinne had said, and she'd finally looked at him, and there had been something in her eyes that Marcus had recognized as the same thing he was probably feeling. Exhaustion, sadness, the weight of a situation that had spiraled beyond what either of them had intended. "I don't think we have the same definition of fair," Marcus had said. "No, I don't think we do," Corinne had agreed. And that had been the end of the coffee meeting. They'd left separately, paid for their own coffee, and didn't speak to each other again for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Marcus's lawyer had sent another offer, this time for the full electricity cost, $1,500, plus a written agreement allowing continued access for 6 months with a subsequent review. It was a reasonable offer, or at least it would have seemed reasonable to Marcus a month ago. Corinne's lawyer had rejected it without a counteroffer. Instead, he'd filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit itself had been surprisingly small, just a stack of paper that arrived at Marcus's door on a Tuesday afternoon, certified mail, the official notification that Karen had decided to take him to court. The papers outlined her claims: breach of implied contract, negligent interference with economic relationships, and a request for a judgment of $5,000 plus legal fees. David Torres had reviewed them and said, "It's not a strong case, but it's possible that a judge could see it her way, especially if she testifies about how much she needed this. Judges are people. People sympathize with people. How much is this going to cost me? We're easily looking at $10,000 to $15,000 in legal fees by the time this goes to trial, and that's before any judgment." Marcus had felt something break inside him then. Not dramatically, just quietly, like a small bone fracturing in a place where no one would see it. He'd called Sarah and told her everything, and she'd listened quietly and then said, "We need to decide if this is about being right or if it's about being practical." "What's the difference?" "Being right means winning the lawsuit. Being practical means figuring out what the cheapest way to make this go away is." "The cheapest way is to pay her what she's asking for." "Yes," Sarah had said, "and then we add a clause to the settlement that says she can't use the charger anymore. So you get your charger back and she has to find another solution. And then maybe you sell the charger, or maybe you just stop using it as a donation to your neighborhood's transportation problem. Either way, it's done." Marcus had presented this plan to his lawyer, who'd nodded and said it was the most practical solution he'd heard all week. The settlement offer had been prepared and sent to Karen's lawyer. And Karen's lawyer had rejected it without discussion. "She's out for blood," David Torres had said, which was unprofessional and also probably accurate. "Or she's out for principle, and they amount to the same thing once lawyers get involved. So what do I do? We fight her in court. We show up with documentation of every charge. We calculate the actual cost of the electricity. We demonstrate that she had multiple opportunities to discuss payment terms with you, and we let a judge decide." But before they could get to court, something else had happened. Marcus had been checking his mail one afternoon when he'd found a large envelope from Karen. Not official, not from her lawyer. Just a regular envelope with his name written in her sprawling handwriting. Inside was a check for $1,500. And a handwritten letter. "Marcus, I'm paying you for the electricity. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do and because I don't want to be the kind of person who steals from her neighbors even if it's just electricity. My lawyer said not to send this, said it looks like an admission of liability. But I'm tired of listening to lawyers. I'm tired of this whole thing. I still think you should have handled this differently. I still think you could have been kinder. But I'm not blameless either, and I know that. I should have asked about costs from the beginning. I should have assumed that nothing is free. I'm dropping the lawsuit. I called my lawyer this morning and told him to withdraw everything. It's going to cost me money to do that. Apparently there are fees involved in quitting your own lawsuit, which seems wrong but apparently is a thing. But I'm done. I can't afford to keep fighting you, and I don't want to anymore. I'm going back to paying for gas, and I'm going back to being a person you nod at in the driveway, and that will just be what we are. Neighbors who didn't quite work out. I hope the charger brings you as much happiness as you thought it would." Karen. Marcus had read the letter 3 times, and he'd felt a lot of things. Relief, confusion, anger, guilt. All of them simultaneously, each one canceling out the others until he was just numb. He'd called David Torres and had him verify that Karen's lawsuit had indeed been withdrawn. It had. The case was dismissed. It was over. And Marcus had felt exactly like he'd won something and lost everything at exactly the same time. Sarah had read the letter without saying anything, then set it down and gone to make dinner. He'd heard her in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets, running water, moving through the space with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for years and knew exactly where everything was. "What are you thinking?" he'd asked, standing in the doorway of their kitchen, still holding the check. "I'm thinking that she just taught you a very expensive lesson about what happens when you try to be helpful," Sarah had said, not turning around. "And I'm thinking that you're probably going to make the same mistake again someday, because that's what people do. And I'm thinking about what you're going to do with this check." "What do you mean, I'm going to deposit it?" "Are you?" He'd realized he wasn't sure. Sarah had turned around, her hands soapy, her expression tired. She apologized. She paid you. She dropped the lawsuit. And she's essentially exiling herself from her neighbor community because of what happened. If you deposit that check, you're making it real. You're making it a transaction instead of an apology. So the question is whether you want that. Marcus had thought about Karen, driving her Range Rover on longer and longer routes to avoid using gas. He'd thought about her in hospital scrubs, working shifts, managing 2 kids and a job, and the shame of losing a lawsuit that she'd probably never wanted to file. And he'd called David Torres again. "I want to know if we can negotiate something with her," he'd said. "Something simple." "What kind of something?" "I don't know. Something that lets her keep using the charger without it being a legal nightmare. Something that costs less than what a lawsuit would cost both of us." His lawyer had been quiet for a moment. "You sure about this?" "No," Marcus had said, "but I'm sure that I don't want to win if this is what winning looks like." The new agreement was simple in its architecture, though it had taken nearly a month of back and forth through lawyers to negotiate. Karen would pay $200 per month for unlimited access to the charger. That was roughly what Marcus's actual electricity costs were, plus a small percentage toward his maintenance and the cost of the installation. The agreement would be reviewed every 6 months. There was a clause that allowed either party to terminate the arrangement with 30 days' notice. There was another clause that stipulated that disputes would go through mediation before legal action. And there was a provision that said if Karen missed 2 consecutive payments, Marcus could restrict access with written notice and a 15-day cure period. It was the kind of agreement that sounded cold and transactional on paper, which was probably why it actually worked. It removed the ambiguity. It removed the question of whether this was a favor or a business arrangement or something in between. It was just a thing, clear, defined, understood by both parties. Karen had signed the papers, and Marcus had signed them, and they'd both dated them in their separate locations, never meeting in person. David Torres had filed the signed copies and sent copies to Karen's lawyer, and that was that. The first payment had arrived on the 1st of the month, regular as a utility bill. The second one had arrived on the 1st of the next month. By the 3rd month, it had started to feel almost normal, though normal had taken on a different shape than it had before. Marcus would see Karen's car plugged in when he came home from work, and he wouldn't feel anything except maybe a small acknowledgement of the fact that the system was working. She would charge her car, and he would charge his, and they would occasionally nod at each other across the driveway or in the street, and it would be the kind of relationship between neighbors that was cordial but distant. Sarah had stopped asking him about whether Karen had charged again, which he'd only noticed because he'd realized it had been weeks since she'd asked. The question had simply faded away, like it had been something temporary rather than permanent. 3 months into the arrangement, Marcus had run into Karen at the grocery store, in the produce section, where they were both reaching for tomatoes at the same time. "Hey," Karen had said, and her voice had been friendly in a way that was distinctly different from the polite voice she'd used in the coffee shop or through their lawyers. "Hey," Marcus had said back, "how's the car working out?" "Good," Karen had said, and she'd smiled a little. "Still saves me a fortune on gas, and the commute is better now that I know it's sustainable, you know? Like I'm not constantly calculating how long I can keep doing this before it breaks me financially." "That's good," Marcus had said, and he'd meant it. They'd made small talk for another minute or two, the weather, their kids, the general state of the neighborhood, and then they'd each gone their separate ways. But something had shifted. Marcus could feel it. The tension that had existed between them had started to dissolve slowly, like it was something that could only happen with time and the regular, ordinary act of not fighting anymore. A month later, he'd seen Karen's daughter outside doing yard work, pulling weeds, looking deeply unhappy about the whole situation. Marcus had mentioned to Sarah that the yard looked like it could use some help, and Sarah had suggested that maybe he could mention it to Karen. He'd resisted at first. That felt like overstepping somehow, like he was trying to buy back the friendship he'd never quite had. But eventually he'd knocked on Karen's door on a Saturday morning and offered to have his landscaper include her yard in the weekly schedule, which seemed like the kind of thing a neighbor might do without anyone reading too much into it. Karen had been surprised and had said no at first, and then had asked how much it would cost, and when Marcus had told her he'd just add it to his service, she'd gotten a look on her face like she was about to cry. "That's very kind," she'd said quietly. It's really not a big deal, Marcus had said, which was only partially true. Sarah had been upstairs reading when he'd gotten home, and he'd told her about the conversation, and she'd smiled at him in the way she smiled when he was being better than he usually was. What changed? He'd asked her that night lying in bed. What do you mean, what changed? Between now and 3 months ago, when I was ready to fight her in court, what's different? Sarah had thought about this. You realized that you didn't actually want to be at war with her, and she realized she didn't want to be at war with you either, and you both decided that a few dollars a month was less important than being able to walk past each other without your stomach clenching. Is it really that simple? No, Sarah had said, but the alternative is much more complicated, so you pick the simple version whenever you can. 6 months after the agreement had gone into effect, they'd held the review meeting, just the two of them, sitting in Marcus's living room, which had felt like a big step at the time. Corinne had looked around at the space where the conflict had originated and seemed smaller than she was, contained by the memory of those meetings with lawyers and accusations. The arrangement is working, Marcus had said, at least from my end. Same, Corinne had agreed. Actually, better than I expected. I thought this whole thing was going to keep being weird, but it's been pretty normal. Yeah, I mean, it helped that you added my yard to the landscaping service. That was, I don't know, it felt like you were saying you didn't hate me, you know. Marcus had realized then that Corinne had been carrying her own version of the shame he'd been carrying. The belief that she'd become the neighborhood villain, the person who'd sued her nice neighbors over an EV charger. He'd been so focused on his own sense of victimhood that he hadn't considered what it felt like from her side. I never hated you, he'd said quietly. I was angry and I was embarrassed about being angry, and then the lawyers made it into something bigger than it was. I know, Corinne had said. I get that now, and I'm sorry for getting lawyers involved. I should have fought harder to keep talking to you. I should have listened better before I decided to restrict your access, Marcus had said. I made that decision to punish you without even having a real conversation with you about what was happening. They'd both sat with that for a moment, acknowledging the specific ways they'd failed each other, the particular cruelties that had been so easy to justify when you were busy being right. Well, Corinne had said eventually, I guess the good news is that we can learn from this, not that I want to do it again. No, Marcus had agreed, definitely not. And then, because Sarah had suggested it, because Sarah had apparently been planning this the whole time and was much better at reading people than he was, Marcus had asked Corinne if she wanted to come over for dinner with her kids sometime soon. A barbecue, probably, nothing fancy, just neighbors. Corinne had looked surprised, and she'd said yes, but tentatively, like she was expecting it to be some kind of trick. It wasn't a trick. 2 weeks later, they'd stood in Marcus and Sarah's backyard with hamburgers and hot dogs and the 2 kids. Corinne's son was 16 and her daughter was 13, running around with Marcus and Sarah's kids, and it had felt almost normal. Not quite like they'd gone back in time to before any of this had happened, because that wasn't possible, but like they'd found a way to exist in the same space without the weight of the conflict crushing them. Sarah had pulled Marcus aside at one point, while Corinne was talking to his mother on the phone about the kids and work schedules. She's actually really nice when you're not busy being defensive, Sarah had said. Yeah, I'm getting that, Marcus had replied. I think she's lonely, Sarah had continued. I think all of that lawyer stuff was her way of saying, help me in the language that the only people who could hear her would understand. That seems like a roundabout way of asking for help. That's because it is, Sarah had said, but people don't always know how to ask directly. A year after the arrangement had begun, the landscaping company that Marcus had been using for years had let him know that they were raising their prices. Significantly. Marcus had been considering dropping some of his services when Corinne had caught him in the driveway one afternoon and asked if everything was okay. She'd noticed that they'd stopped doing the landscaping on her yard. Prices went up, Marcus had explained. I'm cutting back. Corinne had made a face. Let me know what you were paying before, and I'll pay half of the landscaping costs for my yard. I can't afford to pay full price, but I can do half. Marcus had resisted at first, but Corinne had been firm about it, and eventually they'd figured it out. A simple split, documented in a text message, paid by Venmo at the beginning of each month. It had become another transaction, another regular part of his life, along with the $200 a month she paid for the charger and the burgers they grilled together every spring when Corinne's kids would come over and run around with his. The lawsuit and the lawyers and the threatening letters had become something that belonged to a different version of his life, one that he'd been relieved to leave behind. It started with a text message on a Thursday afternoon, 2 years after the original conflict. Corinne had sent him a screenshot of a reviews page on Google, Nextdoor, specifically, though she could just as easily have been referring to any of the dozen neighborhood comment boards that existed online. The review was from an anonymous account. Beware of Marcus Chen at 447 Sycamore Drive. He will lend you something, his EV charger, and then sue you for using it. Very lawsuit happy. Not a trustworthy person. Never agree to borrow anything from this neighbor. Below that review were 4 more, all variations on the same theme, all from accounts that had been created in the last week, all telling versions of the story that were more or less accurate except for the conclusions people had drawn from them. The reviews went on to speculate about whether Marcus was the kind of person who would sue over small things, whether he was vindictive, whether the HOA should do something about him, whether people should be warned. One review was from someone who'd actually written, "He charges people for access to his charger, and then he cut them off when they said they didn't want to pay. Who even does that? He should be ashamed of himself." Marcus had read the reviews with growing horror, then had called Corinne. "Did you post these?" he'd asked without preamble. "No," Corinne had said immediately. "Of course not, but I know who did." "Who?" "My ex," Corinne had said quietly. "He found out about the lawsuit somehow, and now he's mad because I didn't tell him about it. He's been trying to make my life difficult for the past few months, and now he's using this as ammunition." Marcus had sat down. "To do what? To what end?" "To make me look bad," Corinne had said. "Or to make you look bad, I'm not entirely sure. He just likes chaos, and this is chaos." "Corinne, I'm getting lawyers involved again," Marcus had said, already feeling the dread of returning to that landscape. "Wait, don't," Corinne had said, and her voice had been urgent. "Please, just wait, let me talk to him. He'll take it down. He just needed to express his anger and then he'll get bored and move on to something else. That's how he works." Marcus had waited, but Corinne's ex hadn't taken the reviews down. Instead, the reviews had gotten longer, more detailed, with more embellishments. One review claimed that Marcus had threatened Corinne. Another claimed he'd called her a thief. A third suggested that he'd used some kind of financial manipulation to coerce her into an ongoing payment arrangement. None of it was exactly false, which was what made it so dangerous. David Torres, when Marcus had called him, had used the word tortious interference again, but this time applied to Marcus's reputation. He's essentially committing fraud by posting false reviews under false names, which means we could argue defamation. But proving which reviews are his, and proving which statements are actually false as opposed to just misleading interpretations of true facts, that's going to be complicated and expensive. "So what do I do?" "You could send a cease and desist to Corinne's ex, but he's basically already shown that he doesn't care about legal consequences. You could try to get Google to remove the reviews, but that's slow and usually ineffective unless they're egregiously false. Or you could make a statement on the same platforms clarifying what actually happened." Marcus had chosen the last option, drafting a response that explained the situation without explicitly naming Corinne or her ex, clarifying that he had offered access to his charger with the expectation of payment, that the arrangement had been formalized into a legal agreement when there was disagreement, and that the situation had been resolved mutually. He'd posted it on the reviews and sent copies to his lawyer. Corinne, when she saw his response, had called him crying. "I'm so sorry," she'd said. "I'm so sorry that you're dealing with this because of me." "This isn't your fault," Marcus had said, which was true and also wasn't entirely true. She'd made a choice to let her ex into her life, and he'd made a choice to weaponize her history with Marcus. But Marcus had been the one who'd first set up the conditions that made all of this possible by deciding to restrict access to the charger without warning. Or had he? Marcus had spent the past 2 years going back and forth on this question. Who was responsible for what, and when did accountability stop and understanding begin? "I'm going to talk to him again," Corinne had said, "and this time I'm going to make sure he understands that he needs to stop." "How are you going to do that?" Marcus had asked, though he could guess. "I'm going to get lawyers involved," Corinne had said, and he'd heard the irony in her voice. I'm going to tell him that if he doesn't take down every single review and stop posting anything about you, I'm going to pursue legal action against him for defamation and harassment, and I'm going to mean it. Will that work? I don't know, Karen had said, but I'm going to try. It had taken another month, but the reviews had come down. Karen's ex apparently had believed her when she'd said she would go to court, and he'd removed all of the fake accounts and all of the posts, and then he'd apparently stopped trying to contact her, which had been the actual goal anyway. The legal threat had just been the thing that finally convinced him it was time to move on. Marcus had deleted his response from the reviews, and the whole thing had been over. But it had left him with a strange feeling, something between relief and unease. He'd been sitting at a traffic light a week later when he'd suddenly understood what the feeling was. It was the recognition that this situation with Karen would never actually be over. They'd resolved the original conflict, but in doing so, they'd created an ongoing entanglement. They'd tied their lives to each other, not in a romantic sense, but in a practical one. They were neighbors. They had an agreement. They had a shared history of conflict and resolution and then conflict again. They were stuck with each other, basically. And either they were going to become genuine friends, or they were going to spend the next several years in this weird state of fragile truce, waiting for the next thing to blow up. He'd mentioned this to Sarah that night over dinner. That's the deal you made, Sarah had said. When you decided not to cut her off completely. You decided to let her keep using the charger, and you decided to be kind about it, and you decided not to be at war with her. All of those decisions come with the cost of being tied to her. That's just what relationships are like. Even bad ones. Especially bad ones, Sarah had said. The bad relationships, the complicated ones, those are the ones that actually require effort to maintain. The good ones kind of coast. 2 years became 3 years, and the 3-year mark came and went almost without Marcus noticing. Karen had stopped missing payments once, back in the summer, and had sent him an apologizing message about a work situation, and Marcus had just written back, "It happens," and she'd paid him double the next month. That had been the extent of any real conflict. They'd progressed from barbecues to actual friendship in a way. Not the kind of friendship where they hung out one-on-one or talked about deep things, but the kind of friendship that came from regular proximity and the accumulation of small kindnesses. Sarah and Karen had become actual friends, which had complicated things in a way that was actually helpful. It meant that Marcus couldn't be distant toward Karen without Sarah noticing and giving him the look. Life had absorbed the conflict like a body absorbs a scar. Until the day Karen mentioned, casually, that she was thinking of selling the Range Rover. Really? Marcus had said. They were standing in his driveway, watching her charge the car, which felt like a metaphor for their relationship if you thought about it the right way. Yeah, Karen had said. It's getting old and the payments are up in a few months anyway. I figure I might as well trade it in for something newer and cheaper to maintain. What are you going to get? Probably an electric sedan, Karen had said. Something smaller, more efficient. The whole reason I got the Range Rover was because I thought I needed it for the commute, but I don't, and it gets terrible mileage, and it's basically been a terrible decision. And Marcus had stood there, and something had aligned in his understanding. You could have gotten an electric car 3 years ago if you hadn't had to pay me for the charger access, he'd said quietly. Karen had looked at him, and she'd understood immediately what he was saying. They'd never explicitly discussed the fact that Marcus had effectively subsidized her vehicle choice through the charger arrangement, that the $300 a month she'd been paying him for 3 years had been money she couldn't spend on saving for a better vehicle. Yes, she'd said simply, I could have, but I needed the charger and you needed the money, and that's what we worked out. I didn't need the money, Marcus had said. I wanted to make sure I wasn't subsidizing your transportation situation indefinitely. I know, Karen had said, and that's fair. But the thing about fair is that it's always going to be someone's expense, Marcus. That's what fairness costs. She disconnected her car from the charger and got in to leave. So you're going to buy an electric car now, he'd called after her. Probably, she'd said from the driver's side window. I'm going to get the Leaf or something. Those are cheap. And I'm going to pay you for the charger, but maybe less if that's okay. Like $100 a month instead of $200. Since I won't be paying for a Range Rover anymore, I can actually afford something smaller. Sure, Marcus had said automatically. But Karen had already driven away, and he'd stood in his driveway feeling like he'd just understood something too late to change its course. Sarah found him there 10 minutes later, still standing in the driveway, staring at nothing. "What happened?" she'd asked. "I think I've been punishing her this whole time without realizing it," he'd said. "I think I made her pay me for the charger, and the whole arrangement, it was a way of making sure she understood that she owed me something, that she couldn't just take from me." "Did she owe you something?" Sarah had asked. Maybe, honesty maybe. A real conversation about costs instead of just assuming it was free. "And you got that," Sarah had said. "She apologized, she paid you. And then I kept charging her for access to it for 3 years, while she drove a car that was ruining her finances, because I needed to make sure she understood that nothing is free." "Marcus," Sarah had said, and her voice was gentle, "you don't get to be mad at yourself for being reasonable. You offered her terms and she accepted them. That's not punishment. That's just life. That's how the world works. You can't give things away for free and then get angry at yourself for not giving them away for free." But he was getting angry at himself, had been getting angry for a while, probably. He'd been seeing the whole situation as a story in which he was the victim of Karen's entitlement, and Karen was the victim of her own poor decisions, and both of those stories had been true enough to be useful. What he hadn't wanted to see was that he'd also been the person who'd made Karen's situation worse before he'd made it better. That the charger arrangement had been a way of controlling the situation, of making sure that Karen understood her dependence on him. He'd called David Torres the next morning. "I want to drop the agreement," he'd said. "What?" "The charger agreement with Karen. I want to let her use it for free." "Why?" David Torres had asked, which was a fair question. "Because I can afford to and she can't, and it's the right thing to do." "The right thing to do is not always the smart thing to do, legally speaking," his lawyer had said. "If you just drop the agreement, you're establishing a pattern of offering and then rescinding, which could create liability if something goes wrong with the charger. Plus, she's been paying you. If you suddenly stop charging her, she might feel like you're saying you only did it for the money in the first place." "Maybe I did only do it for the money," Marcus had said. "I don't even know anymore." So instead of just dropping it, Marcus had drafted a new agreement. This one said that Karen could use the charger for free, indefinitely, with the understanding that the arrangement could be terminated by either party with written notice. There was no payment involved. There was no liability clause. It was just, "You can use my charger for free as long as we're neighbors." He'd printed it out and walked down to Karen's house and handed it to her in an envelope without saying anything. Karen had opened it, and he'd watched her face as she read it. He'd watched her understand what he was offering, and then he'd watched her look back up at him. "Why?" she'd asked, the exact same question his lawyer had asked. "Because we've been doing this for 3 years now, and I've made enough money off of it to feel like I'm not subsidizing you anymore. And because Sarah's right that I've been being reasonable, but I've also been being a little bit cruel about it. Not intentionally. But sometimes the most cruel things are the ones done with the best intentions." Karen had read the agreement again, and her eyes had gotten shiny. 6 months after Marcus had changed the agreement, Karen had got her electric Nissan Leaf. She'd traded in the Range Rover and bought the used car outright, which had been possible because she wasn't sending him $200 a month anymore. The first time she'd charged her new car with the charger, Marcus had watched from his window as she'd stood in the driveway with her kids, all of them looking at the Leaf like it was something to be proud of. Her son had taken a picture. Her daughter had hugged her. Marcus had felt Sarah watching him watch them. "Are you regretting it?" she'd asked. "No," he'd said. "I'm trying to understand why I didn't do this from the beginning." "Because you were hurt," Sarah had said simply. "And when we're hurt, we make decisions from that hurt. And then later, when the hurt is gone, we have to decide whether to keep standing by those decisions or to change them." "I think I've been having that realization a lot lately," Marcus had said. "I know," Sarah had said. "That's how you know you're growing." A year later, the charger agreement had become so routine a part of both their lives that it barely qualified as an agreement anymore. It was just part of the landscape of their neighborhood, Marcus and Karen, bound together by that white charging station that sat at the edge of his driveway like a symbol of everything they'd learned and failed to learn, and then learned again. Karen had started a new job that paid better, which meant she could work fewer hours. Her kids had both gotten into good schools. The lawsuit had become a story that they told sometimes at dinners when new people joined their expanding friend group, a story that always ended with the lesson that neighbors are worth more than money, that grace is worth more than being right. But sometimes, late at night, Marcus would still think about that moment when he'd restricted the charger access without telling Corinne. He'd think about the justification he'd given himself, that she deserved consequences for not asking about costs, and he'd wonder how many times in his life he'd made decisions from hurt and called them justice. And he'd think about Corinne, driving away in her Range Rover back then, believing that she'd been treated unfairly, believing that she'd had no choice but to hire a lawyer, believing that the world was full of people like Marcus who would help you and then punish you for needing that help. He wondered if she'd forgiven him, or if she was just better at moving past things than he was. One evening, while Corinne was charging her Leaf, Marcus had walked out to the driveway and asked her directly. "Do you forgive me?" he'd said. "For the whole thing, for restricting the charger, for making you feel like you owed me." Corinne had been quiet for a moment, looking at her car, at the charging cable, at the evening sky that was turning pink and orange the way it had been the day he'd had the charger installed. "Yeah," she'd said eventually. "I forgave you a while ago, I'm not sure exactly when. Maybe when you let me use it for free, maybe before that. I don't know, it's not like forgiveness happens at a specific moment. It's more like you just stopped carrying it." "And you've stopped carrying it?" "Mostly," Corinne had said. "Except sometimes when I'm charging and I think about those lawyers and all that time, and I get a little bit angry again. But then I remember that I hired lawyers too, and I made choices that made the situation worse, and it helps to know that we both did that. It makes it less like you did something to me and more like we did something together, and then we figured it out." Marcus had nodded, and they'd stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower, watching the charger do its work, converting electricity into the ability to move forward. "Thank you," he'd said finally. "For what?" "For being a better person about this than I was." "I wasn't," Corinne had said. "I just got lucky that you decided to be better before I had to be worse." And as the sun disappeared and the charger kept its steady work, Marcus had understood that this was what moving forward looked like. Not forgetting, not pretending the conflict had never happened, but carrying the memory of it as a lesson instead of a wound. The charger would be there tomorrow, and the day after that. Corinne would bring her car, and it would charge, and neither of them would think much about it, because the weight of the history had finally been distributed evenly between them, shared the way neighbors were supposed to share things.